Thank you, Rachel, for having me. Thanks for that introduction. I'm going to share my screen here. It'll take me just a second. All right, hopefully you all can see that, a title slide. It's wonderful to be here. I want to first say that I have a very personal connection to your director, Angie Albright. We're friends, and she was one of my first professors when I started college, my first semester of college. She taught me English. She taught me how to speak. And I think it's so funny and so wonderful that we're both in collections management now, her with the cultural of the Ozarks and me with the natural history of the Ozarks and of Arkansas too. So hopefully we can collaborate on some projects in the future. I think there's a lot of opportunity for that. So let's get into it. I have a lot to talk about. In 146 years of a place, there are a lot of people to talk about, a lot of plants, a lot of discoveries to discuss. But first of all, I think I should cover, some of you know what an herbarium is. I certainly didn't. When I was first introduced to one, I had no idea what to expect. When I first walked in, it was just a bunch of metal cabinets. You can see some of those cabinets behind me here. We have about 150 of those in the herbarium. And so I always note the different expressions on people's faces when they walk in, because when you hear herbarium, you mostly hear the word herb or herb. You think it's a place where we grow herbs. You might not, but many people do. I've heard people say, oh, is it an arboretum? Is it a greenhouse? Is it this? Is it that? Of living plants? Well, no, all of our plants are dead, sadly. And so it's a botanical library. I have a friend who calls me a dead plant librarian because I catalog dead plants. And first of all, let's determine how we say it. Some people are confused about that. There are actually two proper ways to say this word. British English, the Brits typically say herbarium, just like they say herbs and spices. The Americans drop the H oftentimes. We say, I in particular tend to say herbarium, herbs and spices types of things. And so what is it? It is a collection of dried and preserved plants, along with its associated label data that tells us where the plant was collected, who collected it, when they collected it. And we use these plants for research and education. There are a lot of herbaria, and that's the plural of herbarium, in the world. There are nearly 3,000, and they encompass 400 million specimens almost. At the University of Arkansas Herbarium, we have about 125,000 specimens. We're the largest collection in the state, but we're by no means the largest collection in the US. There are some collections that have many millions of specimens in it. But we are the largest and the oldest in Arkansas. I tend to say UARK Herbarium, and the reason for that is because each herbarium that's registered by Index Herbariorum, which is the official agency that monitors these things, they assign us a code when we join, and we were assigned UARK way back when. This practice of putting plants on paper is very old. It was first documented to have been done by the fellow I have in the upper right here, Luca Ghini, an Italian physician and botanist who was active in the 16th century. He's credited with creating the first herbarium. And what he did is he took sheets of preserved plants and he bound them together in a book. It would be very, very portable. You could take it places with you, and his students did the same. One of his students' bound herbaria still exists today. None of Luca's made it, but one of his students did. What I'm showing you here is one of our bound herbaria. It's a book of ferns that is in the collection. Here's a detail shot. Isn't that beautiful? I don't know much about this book. It's bound, I do know that. It's all ferns, and they have the scientific names attached, so I can look those up, and I looked a few up, and I found that these ferns were collected from all over the world. No date, no name, but here's one clue as to its age or where it might have come from. I was trying to age this thing a few weeks ago, and here there's a piece of paper that appears to have adhesive on the back of it, and it says, "Wetting the back be ka." I don't know. So I Googled it like I do everything. And I found stamps, British stamps from the 19th century, from the mid 1800s to the end of the 19th century. It says, in wetting the back, the full statement, in wetting the back, be careful not to remove the cement. And so these were above the perforated line, these instructions on sheets of postage stamps. And so what I think was happening is these were just discarded as the stamps were used, and someone saved them up, and they affixed the plants to the paper with these strips of postage stamps. So I think this book could be from the 19th century. I'm not sure, but that's a pretty good guess, I think, based on what I could find. So that's our only bound herbarium. The rest of our specimens are loose. And Carolus Linnaeus, who was a Swedish naturalist and taxonomist in the 18th century, he is the father of modern taxonomy. We credit him with that. He started the practice of keeping his specimens unbound and stacked on shelves. And one of the important reasons for doing that is so that you could rearrange the specimens as you maybe learned more about them and put them in different groups. And that is how we do it today. That's the majority of our specimens in most herbaria are just loose like this. This is one of our specimens. So it's a plant that we collected from the wild, pressed in a plant press, affixed to this sheet of paper, and put a label along with it. And we like to have the name, where we found it, what type of habitat, the date, and the collector. This specimen was collected in 1878 by Francis Leroy Harvey. And then we store them in cabinets like this by genus, which is a grouping of plants. And within genus, we classify them or organize them by species then. So this folder has a Splenium resiliens, and that's one species. And that folder is full of just that specimen or that species from Arkansas. And then we store them in these cabinets that you can see behind me. The cabinets you see behind me are quite old. These are the new cabinets. This is the latest iteration of herbarium cabinet. Of course, you know, before these cabinets were invented, they were wood and they're really cool, but these are better for the specimens, these metal cabinets. They have a seal on them or a gasket around the edge that provides a tight seal. You may know with your affiliation with Shiloh Museum that insects are a problem with natural history collections, with paper collections. Libraries have their own specific insects that feed on books. We have what are called herbarium beetles, and there are two species that we keep an eye out for. And so these cabinets, if there are insects in these cabinets, it contains them to one cabinet. We can control the infestation. But also it keeps them from the light, and it keeps them just protected from the vagaries of time. So our oldest specimen that I found so far is from 1851. And these things break down over time. So we want to keep them as protected as possible. So they live the majority of their lives in a situation like this. And then we have some specimens, not very many, that are kept in boxes. Some plants don't lend themselves to being attached to paper. So we put them, instead we dry them and put them in boxes like this big leaf magnolia, wood sample and fruit sample. And then we have a nice collection of bryophytes here too. If you're not familiar with bryophytes, I know you're familiar with mosses. And the mosses are a type of bryophyte, also liverworts and hornworts. We keep these loose in boxes too, because they don't take well to being glued to paper. And so this is an example of a liverwort, the snakewort. You might have seen that in the woods. And then also this seductive Intodon moss on top of this building. So we have a nice collection of those too. So what is the importance of this? Why do we do this? Why do we keep all these specimens here? The main reason is because these specimens or these places are repositories for what we call type specimens. Now, a type specimen, I'm showing you a picture of one on the right here. This is of Stearns medlar, which is a species that occurs in the Grand Prairie region of eastern Arkansas. This is the type specimen for that. So when this species was described as new to science, it was written down in a journal, published in a journal article, and then this specimen was collected and designated as the reference point for that description. And so type specimens serve as that. They're the proof that the species is what we say it is. And it's a point of reference we can go back to. These are incredibly important. They're the most important specimens in an herbarium. The UARK Herbarium has between 65 and 70. I'm always finding new ones in the main collection. When we find them, we separate them and put them in a special cabinet by themselves, all together by themselves. And my advisor and former director here, Dr. Gentry, when I first started here in '03, one of the first things he said to me was something his major professor had told him when he was a student at Columbia. He said, if there's a fire, grab the types and run. And he repeated it over and over again. And I think he was serious because he kept the specimens close to the front door, the types. And I'm sure we should have done drills, you know, that grab the types and run. So that's not the only reason they're important. They document the plant diversity of a particular region. In UARK's case, we're documenting Arkansas, Arkansas's flora. They also provide an identification reference for students and professionals who might need a refresher on identification of certain species. And then the herbaria also in more recent years have aided in the research of many other biological fields. I just learned as we were starting this program that Rachel, who introduced me, discovered these specimens as she was researching my talk. And she's using them, hopefully we'll find some usefulness in them for her master's work that she's doing. So these specimens are just invaluable for many, many different reasons. Okay, so let's talk about the history of this place. This herbarium was founded in 1875. You might know when the university itself was founded. You might be thinking 1871, and you would be right. We opened to classes in 1872, and just 3 years later, Francis Leroy Harvey arrived from Iowa with a Bachelor of Science degree, and he arrived here to head up the chemistry department. But he also had expertise in geology, botany, mammals, birds, insects, and general biology. He was just proficient in many biological fields. And he immediately started collecting plants when he got here, and birds and insects and minerals. He collected a lot of different things. And he is credited with starting the UA Herbarium, the UARK Herbarium. He's also credited with starting the University Museum, which now has millions of specimens in its collection. So he worked all over Arkansas. And you can imagine in 1875, during Reconstruction, at the tail end of that, roads, good luck, right? Getting around on roads. The railroad was booming though, and university professors enjoyed a free pass from the railroad system. And so he took advantage of that, and he moved all over the state using a free pass from the railroad. He traveled to Miller County, which is extreme southwest Arkansas. We have records from near Monticello in southeast Arkansas, Clay County in northeast, Little Rock, the Grand Prairie in east central part of the state, and of course, lots of specimens from northwest Arkansas where he was based. Not only was he a prolific collector, he also published quite widely on botanical topics. He published many papers, and he wrote the first guide to trees of Arkansas, and I particularly pay attention to that because I just completed with two of my co-authors a guide to the trees and shrubs and woody vines of Arkansas. So I think he and I might have been friends. I think we would have had a lot in common. He collected, I think I said he collected thousands of specimens. If I didn't, I'm telling you now, thousands of specimens while he was here in 10 years. And one of those was red bay. And this is his specimen of red bay. It's not dated, but we think, and there's a note on the specimen that you can't see, that we think he collected it in 1881 based on other records that we have of his movements through Arkansas. So this is a plant that occurs in the edges of swamps and in seepy areas, kind of really wet areas, or in kind of mesic or medium moistured soils on slopes. And here's a picture of it, because really you can't get a sense of what it looked like alive from a plant specimen. But he collected it here, we think in Miller County. Let me go back. Not that you can see it, but he said low country, southwest Arkansas is all he wrote. But based on other specimens and other information we had, we think he was in Miller County. Now, if you look at the main distribution of this plant, it's this light green shaded counties and the yellow shaded counties. That means it's rare in those states. It's a coastal plain species. It shouldn't really have been found up here, yet we trust that he did find it here. He was a man of science. He told the truth, and he wrote that he found this plant. It's the only time ever that this plant was found in Arkansas. That remains the only proof that it did occur here. It may be gone. It may be just that it's there and we just haven't been able to relocate it. But his specimens are incredibly important to us today because of facts like this. Oh, he was also well respected as a botanist beyond the university. He corresponded with all the top botanists of his time. And he discovered a couple of species that were new to science at the time. And I should take a pause here because of something Angie and I talked about yesterday, was about calling something new. We have to acknowledge that if we call it new, we understand that we're not the first people to discover this, right? Or the first biological organisms. Insects were aware of these plants way before we arrived and started naming them. Rodents, birds, other mammals were aware of these plants, and they used them for food, for shelter, for habitat. And then, of course, the native people who were here long before Europeans settled the area were no doubt aware of these plants, whether they had a name that got passed on or not, whether the memory of those plants got passed on or not. They were known before us. So when I say new to science, I'm talking about something very specific. And I just want to make sure that you understand that I know that. So he discovered as new to science, Harvey's beak sedge, and the person who described it, William Boot, named it in his honor, Rhynchospora harvii, or Rhynchospora harvii. He also discovered this cute little thing. You may have seen this in the woods. The previous plants known from the Grand Prairie, it might be here too. I'm not completely positive on its distribution, but Harvey's buttercup, we see this around. We see it in the woods when we're walking around in the early spring, and he discovered it too, and it was named in his honor. So those are just two. I think there were more plants than that named after him, but those are the two I know of. So for some reason, and maybe someone at Shiloh knows this, the state legislature dismissed all of the faculty of the university, as it was the Arkansas Industrial University, as it was known then, in 1885. So all the professors got fired, and I don't know why. I just know that it happened. And so Dr. Harvey was dismissed at that time. And I shouldn't call him Dr. Harvey because he wasn't a doctor at that time. He did not have a PhD, but the university thought so much of him that they awarded him the second PhD that they awarded in 1890, 5 years after he was dismissed. So I know they regarded him very highly. I've read through all the university catalogs of the time, and he was well respected by the university and by his peers. Unfortunately, he was dismissed. I feel like the university the herbarium could have been much bigger. He had high hopes for this place. He, in the university catalogs of the time, it was written that they hoped to accumulate all the indigenous flora of North America, specimens from all of it. And so he had a big plan for this place. And after he left, the focus became more Arkansas, which was more attainable for sure, and the surrounding region. But I do wonder how big this herbarium would have become if he had stayed and was able to build it up. Like I said, he left in 1885. He ended up in Maine as the state geologist, which was another one of his specialties. And he died at a very young age, at the age of 50. Very sadly, his obituary and other writings indicate that he may have actually taken his own life. He suffered from depression, and his mother had passed away, and they said he had been overworked as well. So that's why researchers arrive at that conclusion. Kind of a very sad end to a really nice person's life, an accomplished scientist. One thing he did to increase the collection while he was here was he offered a prize of money to his students. I don't think we can do that anymore. I need to look into it. But it was called the Harvey Botanical Prize, and he would give them $10 give $10 to the person who collected the best 150 species of Arkansas plants. They had to be mounted on paper and classified, which means they had to be accurately identified and the name written on the label. And what do you know, a female student won the prize in 1878. I love that. So much of the history of the herbarium is about men, about white men. and we don't have a whole lot of diversity here in our history, but we do have a lot of women who have been involved. And so I'm really happy to find this and to know that it was a woman, a student who was a sophomore, and she was actually from Fayetteville. So it was really cool. And this is one of her specimens. Well, we know she submitted 150, but only 3 survive that I can find in the collection. And she did a really nice job. And so often you see these, they'll write the name down and it'll get crossed out and there will be a different name on a new label indicating the student got it wrong, but not Jessica. She got it right. And you may have seen this plant in the woods. It's a common plant, yellow pimpernel, a member of the carrot family. Pretty cool, huh? So after Harvey left, the herbarium fell into obscurity for a while. And in fact, for the next 31 years, I don't have much information on any professors who took over as director or guided the herbarium or built it up. And so I call them the wonder years because I just wonder what happened. I don't know if it was an administrative decision to kind of shelve the herbarium for a while. They stopped talking about it in the university catalogs. They still talked about the museum though, which is unusual because, and they listed all the holdings of the museum, the main, like how many bird specimens and how many skeletons they had, but they never mentioned the herbarium in later years during this period. So I wonder, and I only have 46 specimens in the collection left from that time, and the majority of those were from student collections. And so I think that, the professors were teaching botany and they still required the students to make a collection, but there was no champion of the herbarium. And so it just kind of fell into obscurity for a while. But what I do have is this picture of the museum. And I'm convinced that these are herbarium specimens on the back wall. Now, being in a virtual environment, we can't really zoom in and look very closely, and I don't think it would hold up to zooming in anyway, but I'm just going to believe that those are herbarium specimens on the wall. And this is evidence that the herbarium still existed. So like I said, we had a lot of students who collected, 24 that we have specimens of still today. And this is where I think a collaboration with Shiloh Museum would be very interesting. Is I have a lot of these students' names, but I don't have photographs of them and I don't know much about their histories. So I picked 3 here that had last names that were common names in this region at the time and still are. So Maud Nix was one of them. She was here in the 1890s, 1893. She collected this specimen of slender mountain mint from open fields in Fayetteville. Nell Hunt, I don't know if she was related to the Hunts or not, but there's her beautiful handwriting. That's another thing about the herbarium. There's so many different types of amazing handwriting in here. Someone who's interested in that would have a field day. She collected this yellow water lily from ponds in Fayetteville. And then we have this guy, Charles Julius Leverett, who collected this very common species, white vervain. We see it all over the place. It's kind of weedy. And he got a little cheeky on his label. They were supposed to write the habitat. And what does he write? Everywhere. Now, if that had been my student, I would have docked him a few points for that. Just, you're supposed to put the habitat, not everywhere. But then I would have laughed. I laughed when I saw this. I laughed out loud, and I would have given him his points back for making me laugh. And he's not wrong. This plant does grow everywhere. It likes dry soil, a little bit wetter soil. It likes disturbance. But I think the reason he could get away, or that he thought he could get away with writing that, is because his father was a professor here at the university. So he probably got away with a lot of stuff. But there's a picture of that plant. All right, and then the most notable, actually the only student I could find a picture of readily is Alice Simmons or Simons. I'm not sure how that's pronounced, but she was a student at AIU in the 1890s. And the reason we have a picture of her is because she was a founder of Chi Omega, of the Psi chapter of Chi Omega. And there she is, number 6. She went by Allie. And I found this on Chi Omega's website. They have a whole page devoted to her. And because of that, I know also that she was a talented illustrator, and she had an interest in drawing biological things. And she became a biological illustrator for a time after she graduated. And she drew this. And this was published in a publication that one of the professors on campus wrote. She drew the illustrations for that. Pretty cool. And I think I have 5 specimens of hers from this period of her being a student. All right, so then we enter an era of just heightened activity from 1918 to 1926 and into the current day. Just a lot of activity. John Buckholtz was the director of the herbarium and a UA professor beginning in 1918. He was a woody plants specialist and a gymnosperm specialist. So if you're not familiar with what a gymnosperm is, it includes, among other things, the conifers or the pines and the cedars and things like that. He also conducted extensive field work in the state while he was here, collected a lot of specimens. We have hundreds of his specimens. And he also wrote Forest Trees of Arkansas along with Wilbur Mattoon, which was the first version of what later became Trees of Arkansas. He also described, as new to science, Ash's juniper, or Ozark white cedar, as he called it. And this was brought to his attention by William Willard Ash, who was a forester. And this was in Izard County, north of Mountain View, where Mr. Ash found these cedars, and they looked different. They looked similar to Eastern red cedar, and they're closely related, but they just looked different. There were a lot of differences. And in fact, they are very different. They're multi-trunked trees instead of a single trunk like our Eastern red cedars are. And they have this white bark. Eastern red cedar doesn't have that. There were a few other key differences between the two species, but they discovered that it was new, and Dr. Buckholtz was able to be the author of that new species. You all know these plants, don't you? If you spend time in the woods in the early spring, you know Trillium. They're some of our most beloved spring ephemerals. I love to see them in the spring. These are our 3 common trilliums in Northwest Arkansas. There's one that occurs in the Eastern Ozarks, but we don't have it here. Toadshade, Ozark green trillium, and prairie trillium. While Dr. Buckholtz was here, he found a new trillium that did not look like any of these. In fact, it looked just like this, because it was this. These plants are on stalks. The flowers are stalked. They're just very different. And so he found it in the early 20s, I think around 21 or 22. And he sent it off to an expert at the Missouri Botanical Garden who agreed it was different. And he wrote back to Dr. Buckholtz and said, if this ends up being a new species, I would like to name it Trillium buckholtzii. And so for some reason though, and Dr. Buckholtz said, okay, yes, you don't have to, but you always have to say, oh, please don't. But secretly they wanted to have plants named after them. It ended up not being called buckholtzii. It ended up being called Ozark Trillium, Trillium ozarcanum. It's a rare species in Arkansas. It's rare throughout its range. It occurs in drier soils than our other trilliums do as well. But for some reason, and I don't know why, it wasn't for another 14 years. It was another 14 years before the species was actually described. And it was not described by this researcher at Mobot. It was described by Ernest Jesse Palmer and Julian Steiermark. These men are 2 of Missouri's famous botanists, most well-known. We have many specimens of E.J. Palmer's at the university here. He collected extensively in Arkansas and deposited many specimens here. This is one of his camps, a picture of one of his camps in the Davis Mountains in Texas in 1926. And these are his plant presses. Those are full of plants. And so he'd just go on collecting expeditions. He was a mentor of Julian Steiermark, who is very well known in Missouri and beyond for writing The Flora of Missouri in the early 60s. And for some reason, these 2 men ended up being the ones who described Ozark Trillium, and they named it that because it was from the Ozarks. instead of being called Buckholtzii, even though we have proof that Dr. Buckholtz did discover the species in the 20s. I don't know, it's a mystery. Maybe I'll find more information as I do more research. But the short of it is Dr. Buckholtz made a lot of significant contributions to the flora. And then we enter the more modern age. Some people knew Dwight Munson Moore. Some people living today knew him. He was a UA professor and curator of the herbarium from 1925 into the 50s, and he was head of the botany department for many years. He had a special interest, like many of these botanists, he had a special interest in woody plants. And he wrote checklists or lists of the woody plants that we knew to occur in Arkansas during that time. He published that in 1941. He did the same for grasses in 1961. And here he is. I found this picture in special collections. It's a gem. This is his first semester as a professor at the U of A. He's brand new, looking really slick, with his pole pruners reaching high up into an ash tree to collect specimens for all the students, and two nuns who for some reason joined him on his trip. And they're on the university campus. So the nuns may have been taking a botany class along with the rest of these students. I really don't have an explanation other than that. So he was outstanding in Arkansas. He's considered Arkansas's most beloved botanist at that time and for many years after. And he trained many people who became professional botanists or worked for government agencies after. But he, not only was he an academic, he was a tough teacher too. I've seen some of his grade books. He gave a lot of D's and F's. He was a tough teacher, an academic, widely published, but he was also a botanist of the people. He was known as Dr. Dwight, affectionately. Still a respectful nickname, but they called him by his first name, Dr. Dwight. And he brought botany to the masses. He was active in the garden club movement. He took garden clubs on many field trips. He wrote articles for popular magazines, talked about how you can use natives in gardening, and he gave presentations statewide on botanical topics. And most of us, including, hopefully you recognize this book. This is a book that is still in use. Well, until just about 5 years ago, it was still in use. It was revised again. But all of us had a copy of Trees of Arkansas, I think. Anybody who was in school for decades had this book and learned from this book. So he was well known by academics and lay people alike. And one of his more significant contributions was that he discovered Delphinium newtonianum as new to science in 1936. This is a beautiful larkspur that is a rare species. It's rare throughout its range. It's also endemic, so its range is very small. It's endemic to Arkansas. And what that means is it's known only from Arkansas and nowhere else in the world. And in fact, it occurs in a few counties in the Ozarks and in just a few spots in the Ouachitas as well, but they've never found it outside of Arkansas. And so when he found it, he was driving down the road, which is so unusual to find a plant new to science as you're driving down a highway, but he was heading south out of Jasper on Highway 7. And he saw this striking blue plant poking out along the edge of the woods. And he noticed it was different because it has this branching habit. And most larkspurs just grow straight and have the flowers straight off that stalk. So he noticed it was different right away. Ended up, it hadn't been described yet. So he named it for the county in which he discovered it and for his father, Newton H. Moore. And he expected that it would be called Newton's Delphinium. That was his expectation. But instead, because he was so well liked, everybody started calling it Moore's Delphinium and it stuck. And that's what we call it today. And this specimen is from 1936. And look how blue those flowers still are. This species, even dried, pressed and dried, holds its color very well for decades. I'm going to skip that. I think I'm going to run out of time. Let me look real quick. Yeah, I'm going to run out of time. Delzy Demery was also a botanist who worked in Arkansas in the 20s and into the 50s. But he was at the UA from 26 to 30. He and Dr. Moore worked together. Two different people I don't think we could have ever met. He, as you can see, look at these pictures. This is how he traveled. He carried a rifle and he carried a plant press. And everyone says he wore his snake boots, his knee-high snake boots everywhere, no matter what, all the time. It was snake boots all the time. He owned a car for like 2 minutes, and then he gave it away to his sister because he didn't like it. He never drove a car again. He only used the bus system and other forms of public transportation to get around. And he managed, despite this fact, he managed to be one of the most prolific collectors in the United States during his lifetime. Estimates are that he collected between 80,000 and 300,000 specimens, which he did all by public transportation. So he would just walk down the road, flag down a bus as it passed. They'd let him on with his gun and his plant press. And then once he found a place he wanted to stop, he would just say, hey, let me off. And they'd let him off, and he'd disappear for days at a time, maybe weeks, I don't know. He hunted his food, he foraged, he drank water out of creeks. He must have, because that's how he traveled. He slept under shrubs when he got tired, and then he'd get up and go collecting again. Goodness. He was amazing. He was known as Old Scratch to friends and colleagues because he would say, I gotta scratch gravel. It's time to scratch gravel, just to get on the road. Let's go. He published a paper on the woody plants of the state, keeping in with that tradition. And then he also self-published a catalog of all the vascular plants of the state that we knew about in the 40s, but he didn't share it until the 70s. He kept this, he self-published a journal called Taxodium, and he didn't share it with anybody until I think 1971. But we credit him with just the fun aspects of being a botanist. And if you see behind me, you can see this metal contraption. A lot of botanists at the time carried this machine or this thing. It's called a vasculum, and they would put their plants in it, and they'd soak pieces of paper or cloth, and they'd layer their plants in this vasculum. He did not do that. He called it an ungainly contrivance, and he refused to use them. He just carried his plant press in the field, and look what a mess. He was doing it well into his 80s, just a mess. Yet he managed, like I said, to collect who knows how many specimens. Just amazing. And here's a picture of Dr. Moore and Dr. Demery together. Very, very different people. It makes you wonder, if they didn't have botany and teaching, and that they served in World War I, all these things in common. They had a lot in common, but they were so different. It makes you wonder, if they didn't have botany in common, would they have been friends? They might have been, but it just seems like an odd couple. Two of our coolest botanists for sure. I want to focus on some notable contributors. I mentioned that we do have a lot of women who collected. No women have run the herbarium as director or as a faculty member or as a professor. They've all been men, but we do have several women who have made notable contributions. Maxine Height is one of them. She lived, this is Strickler on the map here. Prairie Grove is just right up here. She lived in Washington County in the Cove Creek community. She had a PhD in biology, and she studied spiders. She wrote the definitive treatment to the brown recluse spider for her PhD that was used for many decades. It may still be the reference, I'm not sure. But she collected in the 50s. Most of her specimens, we have about 150 specimens, are from 1954. And she collected in this very rugged country in the Cove Creek area. Garrett Hollow, Low Hollow, Cove Creek, Wildcat Hollow. Tells you how rugged it was. She collected by herself often. Tough as nails, she had to have been. She passed in the 90s. Maxine Clark, another Maxine. She was a botanist. She had a master's degree in botany. Her husband, Joe Clark, had a degree in geology. They were co-editors of the Ozark Society Bulletin and staunch advocates for free-flowing rivers in Arkansas. As members of the Ozark Society, they lobbied hard to save the buffalo. They were some of the key players in that fight. And here she is on the right in the hollowed out log of a sycamore tree. And we have specimens from her in the 60s. She collected in the Ozarks, a lot in Newton and Searcy counties along the Buffalo. This was collected from the Nars. You might be familiar with that area. The Narrows, but we call it the Nars. It's this narrow bluff line between Richland Creek and the Buffalo River. She was humble too. This article appeared in one of the bulletins that she co-edited. She and her husband Joe won the Arkansas Wildlife Federation Conservation Award in 1968 for their contributions in the field of conservation. And the only reason they published this is because one of their friends in Ozark Society, fellow members, said, if you don't run the pics of you and Governor, I will personally drown both of you on the next float. This is no time for modesty. And so she says in the next paragraph, we don't want to drown. And so they published their accomplishment here in the bulletin. Other notable contributors are Ed Dale. He was at the university for 32 years and served as interim director of the university. He was a community ecologist who published widely on the plants of Arkansas and ecological communities. Jewel Moore, a PhD professor at UCA and biology professor for over 30 years. Born in 1918, I know that she celebrated her 100th birthday in 2018. I believe she is still living too. For her PhD work, she surveyed Petit Jean State Park, and she deposited many of her specimens here at UARK. Eric Sundell. Now, these are two people I know pretty well. Eric Sundell is a professor emeritus at UA Monticello, and he is an expert in the dogbane family. So the milkweeds and the dogbanes, he's an expert in that group. And he ran the UA Monticello Herbarium for many years. And he revised Dr. Moore's Trees of Arkansas book in 2014. This is the book that's really getting around now. He really improved this book greatly with his contributions. Ellen Turner, well known to many people, a Northwest Arkansas conservationist, a science educator at NWAC for many years, founding board member of the Ozark Natural Science Center, an Arkansas Natural Heritage Commission commissioner in multiple terms. She worked at Hobbs State Park in the 80s, and she deposited some of her specimens here at UARK. So we feel very fortunate to have these specimens here. She also, this is Anna Mae Searles, and this is at Searles Prairie in Rogers. It was 10 acres, but due to Ellen and her husband's work, it increased by 25% recently. They were able to conserve 2.5 more pristine acres, or unplowed acres, I should say, of tallgrass prairie, and add it to that natural area. And now we're at a very much a more recent history here with Edwin Burnell Smith. He was also a longtime professor from 66 to 98. He came here from Kansas after completing his PhD. He worked on the genus Coreopsis, which is the tick seed group. I think he served 3 terms as head of our biology department here at the U of A. He made some major accomplishments and major contributions to our understanding of the plants of Arkansas. He was the first one to put together a comprehensive atlas of the plants of Arkansas. He did this in 1978. He did put a call out to people to bring him specimens and to go out and collect and bring the specimens back, which if they didn't know what they were, he would identify them. And then he'd use those as voucher specimens for his book. He revised that in 1988 with even more species and more records. He also wrote Keys to the Flora of Arkansas in 1994. And this is a book that I came up on and that many students of botany still use today. It's a technical guide that we take in the field with us, and it's a way to identify plants to narrow down the choices as you're looking at a plant in the field. No photographs, very daunting for a new student, let me tell you. He did all these things largely on his own. He's the single author of these works. It's quite amazing. And he also grew the collection by an estimated 50,000 species. So he probably easily doubled the collection, more than doubled the collection during his tenure at the U of A. Now, some of you might be familiar with him, more familiar with him because of a recent publication that was well publicized in Arkansas Florilegium. So on the left, I'm showing you a page straight from Dr. Smith's atlas, plant names and a few details. And on the right, what I'm showing you is the same page in Kent Bonner's copy. That's this gentleman on the right. He is a naturalist. He worked for, I think, the state park system for many years. And he would, just a beautiful artist, and he would draw illustrations of every plant in this atlas. And here it is in his hands here. And they turned it into a work of art, this book that you can still buy. And I strongly encourage you to take a look at that. It's just a beautiful work. But Dr. Smith was involved with this project. He passed before the book was published, but he was involved and very much behind it. And just from all accounts, his family says he was just so honored and happy and kind of tickled that attention was being paid to his book again from the 70s. And he had some notable grad students too, who he had many students, but two that I would like to draw attention to. Gary Tucker, who provided much of the material for this presentation that I'm giving. He is our unofficial botanical genealogist, is what I call him. He's an excellent botanist too. He focused for his PhD on a guide to the woody flora of Arkansas. That was his dissertation. And as me and Theo were writing, in the final stages of writing our field guide to woody plants, we constantly referred back to that work. We'd have a question about a plant or about a species, and Theo would go, well, what did Gary say? And I go, oh, yeah, okay. So we'd go back to the book and we'd look it up and get our answer. So I personally feel very happy about him coming through and being a botanist and contributing what he has to our knowledge of the flora of Arkansas. And then Bernetta Hintertour, who also was a botanist, was a teacher at NWAC for many years. She was one of my teachers when I was at NWAC. She introduced me to the herbarium. She and Sandy Tedder introduced me to the herbarium here. But this is a picture of her, I think in '76, when she was an interpreter at the for the National Park Service on the Buffalo River. Excellent botanist too. And then also related to Dr. Smith is this really fun story. I was at the herbarium one Friday and I get a knock on the door, and it's this gentleman here. And he said, "Is this the herbarium?" I said, "Yes." He goes, "I'm Dr. Smith's son." And I couldn't believe it. I said, "Well, you better get in here." And then he asked if he could come back the next day with more members of his family. And so I put together very quickly just a bunch of things from Dr. Smith's time, his specimens, some of his books, some of his papers. And they came, and the three of them toured around for a little while, and we just had a really good time connecting. They even opened one of the old cabinets and took a big inhale. You know, they took a big sniff because these cabinets smell a very certain way. And so many memories came back when they did that. So that was a really great connection I made in relation to Dr. Smith, because I don't know much about him personally. I know a lot about what he's done professionally, but there's not a lot of records about his interactions with people. So it was just a great experience to be able to meet them. And now we're in the modern era, and I'm almost out of time. Johnny Gentry was the last director of the UARK Herbarium. He was my graduate advisor as well, and he was here for nearly 40 years. He started out as assistant director, associate director of the UA Museum, and was promoted to director. And he ran that place for a very long time before it was closed. Then he moved over to the UARK Herbarium. I shouldn't say closed to the public. It's still open and very much alive. Then he moved over to the UARK Herbarium in '99, and he took all of his energy and directed it toward teaching. He taught taxonomy of flowering plants and dendrology, and he also became coordinator of the Arkansas Vascular Flora Project, which produced a new set of books that enhanced our understanding of the distribution of the plants of Arkansas. And these are just some of the members. It really took about 30 people or more, many years of collecting, analyzing specimens from herbaria, visiting new places, scouring the state. We found over 400 new species that Dr. Smith's atlas did not report. We just didn't know about them. It's amazing. Or specimens, sorry, many more specimens, not 400 more species. Actually, I wish I had those numbers in my head. It was a lot of species new to Arkansas. And many grad students, professors, Theo Witzel with ANHC was instrumental in this. Brent Baker with ANHC, the Arkansas Natural Heritage Commission, also very instrumental. And then there's this person on the right, the upper right. This is Sarah Nunn. She was the collections manager, which is my position now, when I first came to the herbarium. She was a graduate student under Dr. Gentry. She focused on the plants of place in Colorado. But she is one of our most accomplished collectors. We have more specimens of hers than any other woman in the herbarium. I think we have nearly 4,000 specimens that are cataloged of hers. And so she's up there with all of them. Definitely. She's not, maybe not the top collector, but she's in the top 5. I know it. So that's pretty big accomplishment. And so today I was hired almost 2 years ago as the collections manager. I was here from 2003 to 2015 as a student, and now you know how long it took me to get my degrees. But then I came back full-time in a permanent position in 2019, just before the shutdown. I got to do one big open house before we shut down, and about 200 people showed up. So I was really pleased with that. So my job is to promote the herbarium for visiting researchers. We do a lot of DNA analysis of species now, of these specimens. Public outreach is a big part of my job. I do field trips and open houses and things like that when I can. And then also another big part of this job is to image and transcribe the collection. So we've, over the past 7 or 8 years, through an NSF grant, a National Science Foundation grant, we have been able to take pictures of many of our specimens. And that's what you've been seeing this whole time, are specimens that were imaged as part of that project. And now through volunteer efforts, we're entering that label data or transcribing those specimens and making that available to the public on a database that I'll show you here in a second. I don't have an imaging station currently, but due to the very generous donation from one of Dr. Smith's family members, very recent donation, I am about to buy another imaging station. So I'm over the moon about that. I'm going to start imaging some specimens that got missed. I'm going to start imaging out of state specimens and out of the country specimens, and also new collections that we're bringing in. So if it's just the best thing that this has happened. I'm so happy. So if you would like more information about the herbarium, I have a website. I'm on social media. This is where I post events to Facebook. Once I get to start doing field trips again, I'm going to post those to Facebook. And if you have an interest in looking at some of these specimens that I showed you, they are accessible, like I said, to the public at cernecportal.org/portal. And you can do a specimen search here. And then you can choose the UARK Herbarium and look through all of our specimens that have been databased. We have nearly 80,000 specimens online. And like I said, I think we have about 125,000. So eventually we're going to get all of our specimens imaged and more things online. I have many people to thank for contributions to this presentation. Gary Tucker, of course, who I mentioned, our botanical genealogist, has done so much research and gave me the basic tools I needed to go do special collections research. And then the staff at Special Collections has made so many things related to the herbarium available and accessible. I appreciate it so much. And Dwayne and Judy Woltgen with the Ozark Society showed me some pictures and gave me some information I didn't have before. And then, of course, the Shiloh Museum of Ozark History for giving me a platform to promote the herbarium by. So I appreciate it very much. Thank you.
That was absolutely amazing. Do we have any other questions or comments? I know there were a lot of comments going in the chat.
I have not seen any of them. I haven't seen any, and I'm really curious. Oh, yeah. Yes, Ellen is wonderful. Yeah, it's very good. Are there any questions in there? Very good.
Mostly it's just really positive comments.
All right, that's what I like to see.
Okay, Angie's got one.
Okay.
Is there a holy grail or unicorn species you're looking for?
Gosh, yes, there is. There is a barberry, believe it or not, that was collected in the 1800s by a botanist from Missouri who just kind of dipped down into Arkansas and found this species, this plant. We didn't know about it until Theo Witzel went to the Smithsonian Herbarium a couple years ago and discovered this specimen sitting in the Smithsonian. And the reason we didn't know about it is because it hadn't been imaged and put online yet. So it's an American barberry. Now we all know those barberries that we plant, right? We haven't seen it since. I think it was collected in 1888, maybe. I would love to find that plant. For me, that's the holy grail in Arkansas, if I could find that plant again.
Okay, Brenda has a question. She says, when a plant changes a botanic name, how do you amend the plant specimen label?
That's a great question. And I have examples. That's why I'm backing up here. Oh, maybe I have examples. Can you see this down here where I'm pointing at here?
Yes.
You can. Okay, so here's the main label. This is what Dr. Moore, Jewel Moore, put on the label or put on the specimen. And I bet you this is a common plant. She wouldn't have mis-ID'd that, but they will just stick in what we call an annotation label with the person's name who changed the determination, the date, and what the determination was. And so that's the common practice. We never change the plant label. We're not supposed to. Sometimes you see something crossed out, but that was an old practice and we don't do that anymore. We always affix a new label with what we've determined it to be.